Alice Paul was a suffragist who was very dedicated to her work. Paul and thousands of other women protested for their rights outside of the White House in Washington, D.C. on March 13, 1913, and they were the first organization to do so. She explored radical tactics in exchange for the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the eligibility to vote and have a say in government. Before the 19th Amendment, women were treated very differently than they are now. Women did not have jobs, but worked around the house cooking, cleaning, and caring for their children. At the time, only white men from wealthy families could vote. By 1840, all white men in almost every state who were 21 or older were allowed to vote. In 1848, the first women's suffrage convention took place in Seneca Falls, New York, led and organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. By February 18, 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was founded by Susan B. Anthony and was seen as the most prevalent organization in women's suffrage.
Was a merger of two even older organizations. So those two original organizations had been fighting for suffrage at both local and state and national levels since the 1840s, most energetically since after the Civil War.
Many of the most famous suffragists were part of this group, including Paul. The National American Women's Suffrage Association had nearly 3 million members by 1915. Alice Stokes Paul got her first look at women's suffrage from her mother Tacy, who took her to suffrage meetings at a very young age. Alice traveled to England at age 22. While in England, she met the Pankhurst women, Emmeline and her daughter Christabel, who led heckling, window smashing, rock throwing, set fire to buildings and mailboxes, and many more militant tactics to raise awareness for women's suffrage. Even though they were arrested several times, the Pankhurst women made a big impact on Paul's attitude towards protest. After 3 years in England, she returned to the United States, equipped with new ideas to begin a campaign for women's rights. While residing in Washington, D.C., Paul met Lucy Burns, soon to be her colleague in the fight. While working with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Paul and Burns did not like the association's state-by-state campaigns. The two women wanted to lobby Congress for an amendment to the Constitution, so they took a much more radical approach to achieve their goal. They explored many different methods, but decided the best approach was to march with a float in President Wilson's inaugural parade, followed by a demonstration in front of the White House. On March 3, 1913, they picketed for hours in front of the White House gates. Nearly 500,000 people came to watch the parade, and during the parade, thousands of children, men, and some of their wives trampled each other to throw whatever was in their hands at the thousands of parading suffragists. The suffragists continued to demonstrate and rally for voting rights, and the attacks kept getting worse, especially after the United States entered World War I, and spectators accused them of being un-American. The suffragists wondered why men were sent to die in a war for democracy, but women were not allowed the right to vote at home. On March 17th, Paul and her team of suffragists met with President Wilson, asking him for an amendment to the Constitution, allowing women the right to vote, but he said it was not yet time. They met 2 more times in March and were denied each time. In April, Paul and Burns founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, focused solely on lobbying Congress. The women carried out the second half of their plan several months later when they sent hundreds of women to the gates of the White House with signs saying such things as, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" The suffragists also compared President Wilson to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. They made Kaiser banners demanding Wilson to reverse his opposition to the federal amendment, giving women the right to vote. The attacks on President Wilson were seen as unpatriotic and a menace to the United States government. As a result, Alice Paul and the picketers were arrested. They were charged with obstructing traffic and disrupting the peace. On October 20th, 1917, Paul was sentenced to 6 months in prison and was sent to Occoquan Prison in Virginia. Paul's radicalism in prison became the most crucial role in passing the suffrage amendment. After serving 10 days of her sentence, she started a hunger strike. Paul was quoted as saying that food was simply not important to her. The officers and warden of the jail did not like this and started force-feeding her 3 times a day. They usually tied me down by a sheet around the abdomen with another around the lungs. One of the doctors stood behind and pulled my head back until it was parallel with the ground. He held it in this position by means of a towel drawn tightly around the throat. The other doctor put the tube down through the nostril. Then they poured the milk and liquid food into a funnel at the top of the tube. While the tube was going through the nasal passage, it was exceedingly painful. In addition, she was sleep deprived by being woken up with a bright light during the night, held in solitary confinement, and put into a psychological ward. The warden did this under the instruction from the Wilson administration because they thought Paul was mentally ill and it was time that her suffragist career to come to an end. News eventually spread to the public about how the suffragists were being treated in Occoquan, and public outcry escalated quickly. Alice was questioned and considered sane by the psychologist, saying she was determined to get women's rights, even if it meant death. Respected public leaders soon demanded the women be released. Alice and her followers still kept on picketing, but decided to be less provocative with their protesting this time around. Despite all of the obstacles and the fact that women were still picketing even after being arrested impressed Wilson. Once World War I was over in 1918, he encouraged lawmakers to pass the 19th Amendment and publicly announced his support for women's suffrage. On January 10, 1919, with a vote of 247 to 136, the amendment was passed. On June 10, 1919, Wisconsin became the first state to ratify the suffrage amendment. 14 months later, Tennessee became the last state to accept the 19th Amendment.
That was a big change in many women's lives, to be able to vote in national elections without any kind of constraint. I should say that right was difficult for most African American women and women of color to exercise.
After each state accepted the amendment, a star was added to the suffrage banner. After Tennessee ratified the amendment, Paul was allowed the honor of sewing the last star on the flag before waving it in front of thousands of cheering women and suffragists, celebrating the outcomes of all their hard work. The amendment was officially added to the Constitution of the United States of America on August 26, 1920. After the painful struggles of the 72 years prior, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, with the help of many more devoted women, got women the right to vote. Unfortunately, even though women were now eligible to vote, they were still not treated equal. Paul decided to devote the rest of her life trying to get an amendment for women's equal rights.
Introduced or was proposed in 1923. It has never been passed, never been ratified. It came close a couple of times, most recently in the late 70s and very early 1980s. But it has never been ratified, even though it's a very short amendment.
The Equal Rights Amendment allowed women the protection from discrimination about their gender.
When it was introduced, it was controversial because at that time there was a lot of legislation that protected women workers on the basis of their sex, and people worried that legislation would be seen as discriminatory because it only applied to women, and that therefore that the equal rights legislation would hurt women workers.
When she died, Alice Paul was seen as a symbol of strength, hope, courage, and perseverance for women across the United States. The women's suffrage movement influenced many other people to stand up for women and equal rights for all people. On March 13, 1913, Alice Paul, along with many other women, became the first organization to ever protest in front of the White House gates. Paul encountered many difficult, strenuous obstacles during her lifetime, but was tremendously persistent and never gave up. Her tactics she explored were radical and got Paul arrested several times and sent her to jail for 7 months. After 70 years, those encounters were exchanged for the ratification of the 19th Amendment, allowing women the right to vote. Alice made a huge contribution on getting the ratification of the 19th Amendment and was a big part of women's rights in general.